I did my project over antebellum women's rights. Women were seen as nothing more than mere objects. Men took the role of the puppeteer, and women took the role of the puppets. Women were seen as the second sex, and were considered second in importance. The women of the U.S. practically had no rights. When they were married, the men represented the family, and the women could not do anything without consulting the men. Women were expected to be housewives and to raise their children. In the 1700s, the only purpose of a woman's education was so that they could become skilled at household duties and chores in order to find a suitable husband. The 1800s brought the most significant changes for women in education with the limited rights they had. Early in the century of 1800, there was a rapid growth in secondary education. The women's rights movement made it possible for women to now get an even higher education than what they were permitted. The schools designated only for women were called academies. Some of the people helping to make the women's rights movement possible and successful were Suzanne B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and Elizabeth Blackwell. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are the ones I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. Susan B. Anthony dedicated her life to women's suffrage. She also traveled, lectured, and canvassed across the nation. She also campaigned for the abolition of slavery. She campaigned for women to have the right to own property and retain their money earnings. When the female academies opened up, Suzanne Anthony took the head position of the girls' department. That was also her first paid position. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She and a few other leaders of this movement made something called the Declaration of Sentiments during the very first Women's Rights Convention. The Declaration of Sentiments was a document signed in 1848 by men and women who attended this convention. The Declaration of Sentiments was presented at the Seneca Falls Convention and was credited with initiating the first organized women's rights and women's suffrage movements in the U.S. Many of the reformers in this movement were also active in anti-slavery movements as well. Angelina Grimke and Sarah Moore Grimke were also one of these leaders. The topic of women's rights impacted the abolitionist movement and the temperance movement. For the abolitionist movement, many of the women who were advocating for women's rights were also advocating for the abolishment of slavery. And for the temperance movement, women were treated very badly due to the consumption of alcohol men were drinking. So this movement was mostly for the abuse of women, for the abuse women were getting from men. Women's rights were impacted by the Industrial Revolution of textile mills and the antebellum educational reform. With the textile mills, this revolution gave women a job to do outside of home. They worked in factories. For the educational reform, this was improving women's and free blacks' education. This also included the academies that was mentioned earlier in the presentation.
Another one.
That's it.